So, our guest tonight, this afternoon, is Professor Robert S. S stands for what, Robert?
It's my grandfather's name, my mother's maiden name, Swaney.
Okay, not very easy to pronounce. So it's Hatten, Robert Hatten, Professor of Music Theory of the University of Texas at Austin. He started there on 1211, but previously he was for many, many years a very important professor at Indiana University. And he was president of the two most important associations of North America, the American Society for Music Theory, that for 2 years ended his term last year, and president for the Semiotic Society of America 2007 and 8. So he's for those who don't know him, he's a very famous theorist and musicologist in the American scene. He wrote 3 books. The first book about Beethoven, you can read the details there. The second book, Interpreting Musical Gestures, Topics, and Tropes. And today he will present an introduction to his 3rd book, just released 2 years ago, A Theory of Virtual Agency for Western Art Music. And then I pass for Professor Hatten to start his presentation, and then we will follow with the members of the table asking questions, okay? And I ask for everybody to turn off the microphones.
Thank you, Rodolfo, and also to Cássia for handling the video presentations here. And members of the Brazilian Society for Music Theory and Analysis. I'm very grateful to be here today and to share with you on virtual agency in this virtual medium. But of course, the virtuality that I'll be discussing is what happens in the mind of a listener as staged by a composer, rather than with the virtuality as a medium of communication, such as Zoom, in which I am nevertheless actually present to your ears and eyes in real time. In music, what makes our experience of agency virtual is that it involves the attribution of energy and intention to an otherwise non-existent entity. There are several ways in which we as listeners can infer agency. First, we hear the movement of tones, itself an inference from mere succession to the energy that links sounds as performed, and as occurring in a virtual environment with properties analogous to our physical environment. For example, we can sense the weight of gravity toward a tonal platform, such as the tonic, and the energy it takes to ascend against that gravity. And the experience of meter is like a constantly refreshed environment in which downbeats and upbeats correlate with our physical sense of down versus up. Listening to tonal movement within the constraints of a virtual gravitational field already suggests an analogy with human movement. And human gestures can be transduced by performers when they energetically connect otherwise isolated pitches, creating the dynamic shapes that we associate not only with movement, but the affective character of that movement as gesture. Successive movements in tonal music may imply goals that can either be immediately realized or indefinitely postponed or even frustrated altogether. Contrasting movements can suggest competing sources and hence analogs with dialogue or conflict, leading to dramatic trajectories. And finally, embodied movements can also be sensed as the movements of thoughts and feelings. They can, in this sense, become in-minded. So if we go to our first slide, What I have just described can be theorized in terms of 4 transformative inferences. First, virtualizing. When we hear movement as action, we infer a virtual actant, that unspecified source of energy capable of producing the energy we hear. Second, embodying. When we hear characteristic gestures and intentional movement, it is possible to infer a virtual human agent possessing those characteristics and intentions. Third, fictionalizing. When we hear one or more agents interacting or pursuing goals, especially if overcoming obstacles, we are likely to hear virtual agents as virtual actors with roles in a fictional drama. And fourth, interiorizing. When we move from embodiment to what I call enmindment, as characterized by the internalizing of movements, energies, actions, gestures, intentions, and even dramatic roles, we can infer virtual subjectivity as a kind of ongoing consciousness involving the development of what I like to call feelingful thought or engaging passions of the mind. Now, these 2 expressions are simply useful ways to avoid the unfortunate dichotomy of emotion and reason in Western thought. Characteristic cues for interiorization as implying virtual subjectivity include rhetorical gestures, which can suggest shifts in level of discourse, or fermatas and rests, which afford time for reflection. Some qualifications may be helpful at this point. These stages may be theorized as progressive, but I am not claiming that listeners necessarily go through these stages systematically in their oral cognition or consciously in their attempt to interpret musical meaning. I would suspect that many of these inferences are so automatic as to be unnoticed or even unremarkable. And since competency in a musical style is not only historical, but learned and aesthetic, it would be difficult for any of those reasons to empirically test these claims without introducing some form of bias in the experiment. Historically, some musical styles may not support certain levels of agency. Aesthetically, some music, especially in a lyrical as opposed to dramatic mode, may not give rise to virtual actors in a fictionalized story or narrative. And culturally, these stages are not necessarily universal, or they may be fused into fewer stages. For example, some cultures may not distinguish embodiment from enmindment, since they do not experience a body-mind separation. Viewing Western music history through an agential lens, however, helps one construct a history of the progressive compositional staging of virtual agential effects. In effect, rather than constructing a history of abstract forms and structures, one could reconstruct the expressive and agential motivations behind the innovations of such forms and structures. Philosophically, breaking agency into these different inferences, these different stages, can counter the arguments against a more simplistic notion of a persona. The theory helps clarify just how much is being claimed with reference to musical evidence for each particular musical case. Complicating my view of virtual agency is the obvious issue of actual agency. Real composers, performers, and listeners, all of whom are engaging in some way with the virtualized agencies and subjectivities that may be inferred from the music. In later chapters of the book, I address some of these issues, including a chapter devoted to performative agency as the stance taken by an actual performer to the virtual agencies that may be inferred and hence projected. and when significant projection of the performer's own agency may or may not be appropriate. Finally, shifts in level of discourse, along with compositional frames, may be cues for narrative agency, which can indeed be staged in the music, but which performers can also assume in their projection of virtual or fictive musical stories. And composers may assume in manipulation of listeners' interpretations of, for example, characters in an opera. And this is where I talk about the Shostakovich's opera, The Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk district. For the most part, however, I have constructed the theory to accommodate non-texted instrumental music in the Western tonal tradition, although I included examples from song and opera and from pre- and post-tonal repertories to give an indication of its practical extensions. Now, having provided a brief overview of the theory, I'd like to explore some musical examples with you. So we'll return to the slides. And the first example, you may recall, is the first one in the book. Beethoven's Piano Sonata in F major, Opus 10, number 2, first movement. As you can see, measures 1 to 4, those are composed by Beethoven. I decided to try out a typical 8-bar sentence construction by taking those opening motives of what I would call the presentation phase and accelerating them, starting in measure 5, and increasing the surface rhythm to create a true continuation structure, then moving in measure 7 and 8 to a clear cadence. In this case, a half cadence, so that the whole sentence structure is like an antecedent of an implied 16-bar compound period. Now, as far as agency, I wanted to use this example to develop from my theories of types of gesture. Spontaneous gesture, dum-bum. Rhetorical gesture, when you have a rest that interrupts the otherwise unmarked flow of the discourse. Dialogical gestures, bum-bum, yada-da-dum, where the yada-da-dum provides a kind of dialogical answering to the first gesture. And even the hierarchization of gestures, because you have the first double gesture on the tonic answered by the same double gesture on the dominant, 5-6-5. So if we go to the next example, this is what Beethoven actually wrote. And you can see his continuation is not at all what I suggested with my own. My continuation, my composed continuation, suggested that the first 4 measures were in some ways a buffa kind of topical gesturing, very lighthearted, playful. And I continued with taking that gestural play over the top, as it were, in the continuation towards a climax of sheer hilarity, if you will. Beethoven swerves in another direction. Now, if we look at this in terms of agency, we can certainly say that each gesture implies an actant. It is an action. It implies an unspecified actant, simply that which acts. But very quickly, we began to move to the next level, which is that of a notion of a human agent, because as you would perform that very first gesture, it already has so much affective character and suggests a human gesture, not just any unwitting action. So a human gesture with some sort of intentionality. And perhaps, as we will see, that gesture might suggest something interrogative, as though you were asking a question. Is it this, really this? Or that, really that? And then moving on from that point. Okay, so then we have taken what could have been 2 opposing actors, the first 2 chords and the triplet turn as being in dialogue, might have suggested 2 opposing virtual actors. But see how quickly we want to absorb those actors into a singular agency and perhaps even a singular subjectivity. In other words, a flow of consciousness in which everything comes together in that flow of conscious expressiveness. Now, what happens at measure 5, what I've marked continuation, is a radical change of texture and of continuity. All of a sudden, we have, in spite of the connecting link of structural pitches C in measure 1, B flat measure 3, and then A in measure 5, there's clearly a Schenkerian, if you will, a sense of voice leading continuity that connects these two. And of course, the tonic in measure 5 completes the tonic prolongation of the first 4 bars. But everything else is radically different. We have a clear lyrical melody on top, a hymn-like accompaniment in the block chords, and all of this lyrically legato. Notice that the melody introduces syncopations, a kind of Mozart rubato, if you will, that helps project expressively this melody against the accompanying chords. And it begins to move progressively until measure 7, E flat in the bass, suggest a reversal, a sudden turn towards the subdominant chord. At that point, we've reached a temporary climax on C to B flat in measure 8, above that 4/6 chord. And then there's a rest. Now that is a great example of a rhetorical gesture. Rhetorical because unexpected, the swerve toward the subdominant. And with the rest, we have a moment to absorb, to reflect upon that rhetorical gesture. And that is what leads us to a deeper level of subjectivity. That, in effect, is the staging of interiority through which we realize that perhaps this theme is not going to simply be so comical as I first suggested, but perhaps we'll move towards a greater level or dimension of spiritual expressivity. Well, if that's the case, then we might begin to rethink the opening 4 bars as perhaps a tentatively posed question for which measure 5 begins an answer. And if we were to look at the recapitulation, we would discover that after a false recapitulation in D major, in which we get all 12 bars of this theme, Beethoven then begins a retransition with the first gesture moving to 2 of F major, the second gesture to 5/7 of F major, and then repetition echoing of that triplet gesture 3 more times clearly makes it sound like a question, to which when finally we get to F major for the recapitulation, we hear measure 5 as the beginning of the recapitulation and the answer to that question. So already in measure 5, we can see that the change of texture, such a radical change of texture, is in itself a rhetorical gesture, in the larger sense that we are swerving from one kind of discourse to another. And in terms of sonata phrase structure, or the phrase structure of the sentence, which is here clearly expanded, we also have justification for this expansion, because the continuation is going to begin an 8-bar hypermetric unit that will be supported by its use for the recapitulation. Now, the 8-bar continuity across the rest in measure 8, going on to 9, 10, 11, and 12 to complete that 8 bars, is made continuous by starting on the exact same chord in the exact same position in measure 9, and leading further to a beautiful expressive climax in measures 9 and 10. Alexander Pierce would say this is a kind of cloud of climax, not just one point, but a kind of climax field. And that's all very expressive, almost a kind of fulfillment. So that leads us on to cadential activity beginning in the second half of measure 10, and where we get the 2/6 cadential 6/4 5/7 to 1. And we've completed a sentence structure, a complete sentence as phrase. Now, this expansion is so radical, an unexpected shift towards the lyrical aspect, that it begins to suggest a sense of freedom, freedom from the objectivity, the decorum, the gallant periodicity, if you will, of the opening presentation phase. Notice I say phase instead of phrase because it's simply a tonic prolongation. And that sense of freedom suggests a kind of emotion, even though we don't know what exactly this piece is about. We don't have a program for it. And Beethoven declined to provide when Czerny asked for poetic programs for his sonatas. He thought about it and basically declined because whatever his initial inspirations may have been, music exists for us to engage with our own subjectivities and to provide the situation that will make this sense of freedom towards something more ecstatic, perhaps something more spiritually profound, leading up into the higher register. Whatever that is, we can engage with it and interpret it in innumerable ways. The only thing that our hermeneutic virtual agential analysis insists upon is that you will apply these understandings to something that follows the trajectory, that mimes the curves and contours, the trajectory of the gestures and the virtual agential experiences of this passage. So, what can the performer add? Certainly when I play this, I'd like to play the first 4 bars rather perfunctorily, although with a sly suggestion that maybe there's a hint of a question here, for which already measure 5 could be a potential answer. And then that premise will be realized by Beethoven as he stages it in the recapitulation. Okay, let's move on to our next example. Here we have Mozart, a slow movement from a late piano sonata, one in which, by the way, Mozart's already beginning to explore developing variation. When Mozart was on his deathbed, he said, "And I'm just learning how to compose and now I have to die." I wonder if he could have meant that he was learning about ways to create even greater continuity and to promote an ongoing musical discourse by evolving from initial thematic material. Anyway, what I've given you here is not what Beethoven wrote as the first 4 bars of this slow movement, but instead what a lesser composer might have, this notion of a prototype, which we can often use to suggest the normative form of a phrase before it gets expanded. We could also use it for the normative form of a phrase before it gets expressively enhanced. And we'll see how Beethoven enhances it. But first we see that it starts out with a very simple merger of voices, simple neighboring and then parallel thirds. That is already a good example of melos, although I did not use this example for that purpose in the book. In measure 2, we drop diatonically to a typical subdominant 2/6 chord in this case, moving to 5/6/5 of 5, or 5/6 of 5, and then on to the dominant structure of the third measure, cadential 6/4 to 5/7, and on to tonic. Very simple. Let's look at the next example and see what what Mozart has done to make this music come alive. As you can see, the drop in measure 2 is no longer the innocent diatonic drop, but a much more tragically inflected drop that might suggest an external agency that has caused a reaction on the part of the internal agent that we're following Da, 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 yum. What's that? And harmonized with a diminished seventh of 5. But then if we begin to realize in a theme, you could already have a dramatic trajectory, just 4 bars to create a dramatic trajectory. Then we see our protagonist, our actorial virtual agent, recovering very quickly from that dissonant drop. With that beautiful expressive turn figure, which we saw climactic in the Beethoven. Turn figures in Mozart and Beethoven are typically the most intimate and expressive of ornaments, and internalizing of ornaments as well. Notice the turn figure is preceded by an anticipation and also suspension. All 3 of these additions to our simple version above heighten its expressivity and make it more and more human and even subjective, internalized. Notice that this recovery is a very positive moment. So it gets the 4/3 suspension that we associate with a kind of religioso context as being spiritualizing. And then having reached that wonderful recovery, almost in a gesture of, oh, thank goodness, we have to accelerate to get to our cadence. So, very quickly, in a sort of shiver of delight, accelerating to the closure of the cadence. Notice how the cadence now, it gets expanded beyond its arrival on the downbeat in the left hand. Now both hands delay the ultimate cadential chord to the second beat. So I use this example to talk about ways in which we can understand degrees and depths of emotional expressiveness, even as we are, part of the explanation involves virtual actoriality and even subjectivity. Let's go on to the next example. Now here, I also have examples from Bach. You may have noticed my first book concentrated on Beethoven. The second book spread it out, Mozart and Schubert on either side. And now this book will be very easy to criticize because I talk about music from Hildegard of Bingen all the way to Shostakovich and Stravinsky and Schoenberg. And there's no way that one person can competently speak about all of this music. But I found wonderful examples, and I wanted to suggest what I mentioned in my opening remarks, that indeed this notion of virtual agency has a history, that composers are successively finding ways of staging these agential effects. This example is a particularly interesting one. It's one that Raymond Monell first used in his book on linguistics and semiotics of music to illustrate my concept of troping. And what we find is a fugue subject, which is very gallant. And then with its answer, we find a counter subject that has the passus duriusculus, or the lament bass kind of descending chromaticism. Now, later Bach does exploit its characteristic passus duriusculus affect. But one could also say that at the beginning, the parallel thirds are such a strong scaffolding for the counterpoint that we might hear the chromaticism simply as chromatic passing tones, nothing more than that, and hear it as a kind of almost pastoralized merging of purport, because in effect, both voices are basically descending in terms of their structural scaffolding. And this is one of the ways in which counterpoint can enable you to bring together opposing topical expressions into a singular expression. In other words, a singular melos. Now, there are two possible interpretations, as I say. On the one hand, you could call this what I call a discursive trope. In other words, you preserve the independent actorial aspect of each line and have them in dialogue throughout. The other way would be to merge them as a kind of melos into a single tropologically enriched a single expressive line doubled, if you will, in two voices. Now that may sound like almost the same thing, but there are slight differences here. In the first case, we have two actors. In the second, we have one agent or even one virtual subjectivity. And it's this notion of melos that enables us to put these things together. So that's a very striking example where the counter subject is radically different from the subject. But of course, they are brought into alliance through the notion of parallel thirds or sixths, which is what I call the contrapuntal scaffolding that we find underlying most of Bach's subjects and counter subjects. Okay, it's part of the inventioning, if you will, as Lawrence Dreyfus calls it in his book, Bach and the Patterns of Invention. Let's go to example next. Here from the Sinfonia in E minor, the three-part invention, we see what I like to call refractive counterpoint, in which the counter material is derived from the subject. You can see that in the left hand, the pickup into measure 2 echoes and then reverses the direction of the right hand's motive. That's one form of refractive counterpoint, where you derive material from the subject. Another form can be seen in measure 4, where you simply, on the surface, use parallel thirds or sixths or tenths to double the single voice. This is an early example of planing in the sense that you're simply enriching a single line rather than literally producing two lines. And of course, it happens with the second note of the answer in measure 3, where instead of having a counter subject in the soprano, we simply double the subject in thirds. Meanwhile, the lower voice is, in a sense, even its oppositional and contrary motion is creating a sense of potential unification. So why would Bach do this? And why, for example, would Beethoven do it in his two counter subjects for his Hammerklavier fugue, which are also derived from the subject? Well, for both composers, there's going to be a later emergence of, in Beethoven's case, a new subject, which will become the counter subject in the double fugue that happens at the end of the finale. For Bach, as we go to the next slide, we will see that in measure 14, a series of 16 notes provide a derived counter subject. Notice how the 16th notes are like a diminution of the initial counter material back in measure 1. So now we have derived an actual counter subject, which will get used against the subject in this developmental section of the Sinfonia. We just cadenced on the dominant key of B minor. And we will go as a typical Durchführung, a leading through keys. We will go through a series of keys as Bach dramatically exploits his now completely unified, even though clearly contrapuntal texture. You'll see the third voice, for example, in measure 16, just a quick little fake entry, fake stretto entry, right? And basically the middle voice is just echoing things. It's more of a two-voice structure here, but it gets enriched by that third voice harmonically, because of course Bach is thinking harmonically as well as contrapuntally. Let's go to example 5C. This, what I called a developmental section, ends, interestingly, not on a dominant to prepare for the return, but on a diminished seventh, a dissonant diminished seventh, a moment of dubitatio, if you will think of it in terms of Baroque rhetoric. And at this point, we return to E minor, but in an unstable way, because that diminished seventh is going to frame the entire return. See how it appears again at extreme registers in measure 42 downbeat. The D sharp's down an octave, the C is up an octave. And that is the dramatic, tragic climax of this miniature expressive genre. You could almost think of the sinfonias as being little tone poems in terms of their dramatic trajectories, not in terms of an explicit program, of course. Now, let's look at the quasi-stretto. Stretto is one of the means by which this notion of refractive counterpoint, or melos, is most obvious. It's almost the trivial example of melos, or refractive counterpoint. Here we just have a quasi-stretto. You can see it in the soprano, measure 37, and then the bass, and then echoed in the alto. What's fascinating is you can find still another quasi-stretto in just two voices. The pickup to measure 41 in the alto, then you have it in the soprano from the E to the A, and at the same time you have the E to the A echoed in the alto voice towards the end of measure 41. So again, these are stretto effects. All the while our original, or our derived counter subject is wandering its way deeper and deeper into the depths. And this notion of a wedge-like contrary motion, I've been doing a lot of work with Bach lately and working on the keyboard suites. These wedge effects are often culminating effects for Bach, in which he tries to create a kind of, well, yes, we could even use the term plenitude, a registral plenitude in this case, of texture, in which he creates the sense of intensification that is so characteristic. Oftentimes the ultimate climax of a work by Bach happens near the end, as we can see in this entire return section, which is basically further developing towards the ultimate crisis climax in measure 42, before working its way down in this twisted, painful fashion, and only in the very last measure, as though an external agency had provided it, the major triad. So let's move forward. Next slide, to Chopin. Now, this is in the chapter where I talk about the contributions of performance to understanding, but I also use this piece and this first page in particular to talk about ways in which we can infer, it's kind of a culminating example, ways in which we can infer types of actants, agents, actors, and ultimately subjectivity. Now, the introduction, as you can see from my analysis, the first three systems leading to the fermata, is all in C major. We only know it's going to be the dominant of F minor when we get the lay thi in measure 8 at the a tempo of C going to D flat and then to B natural. That instantly twists that C into a dominant for F minor, at which point we get the main theme. However, this introductory music, as unmarked as it is harmonically, I mean, after all, it's pretty standard progression. There's not much happening motivically, so we would think, just little descending gestures. It all sounds like a very natural sigh, if you will, if you wanted to humanize it. But you could almost take it as just kind of a pastoral actoriality or actantiality, in the sense that nothing is happening here that's necessarily human yet. It's the backdrop for a human drama. And hence it is more like a natural, actantial, unspecified agency, if you will, the source being perhaps the wind, or if you were in another context, the waves, or whatever, anything that is just unspecified at this point, and happens over and over. It liquidates through those fragmentary repetitions and sets us up for a much more direct melodic expressivity, melody and accompaniment in a clear textural format. Now, the accompaniment in this 6/8 measure, we can understand 2/3/8 measures, a kind of waltz hypermeasure, if you will. And this is very useful for Chopin because he can play on where the downbeat is in his hypermeasure, which he does. He starts with his presumed hypermetric downbeat in the middle of the 6/8 measure, but that is where things actually begin, in spite of the notation. And he does it that way, I suspect, because he wants to reach a notated hypermetric downbeat on the very last measure of this page in A flat major. Now, the theme is outlining the diminished chord, and it's very internalizing in its very inwardness, inward shapingness, if you will, and reflectivity, self-reflectivity is emphasized by the fact that he simply repeats it, right? But then where I've marked B, the motive B, you see the letter I there. That comes from, I would argue, the introduction. What was unmarked in the introduction is now taking on more of a role, an agential, maybe even actorial role. Actorial in the sense that it is being used at the very moment where Chopin turns from dysphoric F minor to euphoric A flat major. In other words, he's echoing the beautiful pastoral, natural sensibility of serenity of the opening. At the very moment, he's turning to that same serenity in his theme. Okay, let's move on to our last example, which is, it's hard to argue that this piece is a sonata, but it certainly does, is in dialogue with sonata aspects. One thing it's not like sonata is that its second theme is in B flat major, and it comes back and resolves itself, if you will, in D flat major with an apotheosis of plenitude, if you will, is there as well. Edward T. Cohn was the one who first called it an apotheosis. But the example that I'm showing you on this page is either at the end of the exposition, having moved ultimately to A flat, or part of a plenitude of thematic integration, which is still developmental. It's an ultimately developmental passage that's leading ultimately to measure 125, which is the climactic integration of all of our three motives that I've analyzed on the first page. A very heroic moment of affirmation. It's just not a theme that you can fit into a typical analysis. This passage is not one that, in a wonderful analysis that Michael Klein gives of narrativity in this ballade, it gets neglected. But it is a central moment, an integrated moment, in which integration can be used to affirm as well as to continue to develop. So we have a kind of stratoing of our fragments that keeps building to this forte in measure 125, and then dissolves, sequentially liquidates, if you will, and melts into a return of the very opening, but not in F minor or F major or C major or anything that you might expect, rather in A major, and hence a point of furthest remove in a developmental sense. And after this little introduction, you may recall that the gradual return happens through a series of ricercar-like, that's Eero Tarasti's description, ricercar-like imitations of the opening motive that keep querying, where are we? Where are we going to go? Okay, in other words, this heroic affirmation in measure 125, along with the affirmation of that B flat theme returning in D flat major, are the hopeful endings that are ultimately denied by the chaotic, tragic, ultimate turn towards the tragic of the closing of this ballade. So in other words, second theme and its resolution are within the sphere of the wished for or the hoped for, not in the sphere of the actual tragic, which is the home key of F minor. So what counts as ultimate resolution in F minor is ultimate tragic inability to escape from the tragic resolution by means of these heroic and apotheotic, however the adjective is, climaxes. So we leave with a sense of frustration. Okay, so that is a quick tour through some musical examples, and we can certainly return to these if you have further questions. But now it's time for your specific questions, which I will attempt to answer one by one. So from our panel, beginning with Maria Lucia Pascoal, I believe. Lucia. I'm not pronouncing this correctly, I'm sure. But...
Maria Lúcia, tá te chamando.
Aqui.
Thank you.
Oi.
And...
Peguei a minha imagem. Hello. My question. In your book, A Theory of Virtual Agents, after some considerations about intertextuality in Beethoven music, quoting Michael Klein and your own writings, you reach the following conclusion. In your words, relevant intertextual connections enhance our understanding of a given musical work from the perspective of later works, not just prior ones. Thus, for contemporary listeners, the virtual subjectivity of a musical work has a future as well as a past. Can you elaborate this point of view? Isn't there a danger for hermeneutics to become mere subjectivity?
Thank you. And the answer to the second question is, of course, yes. But I will elaborate in how I hope to avoid sinking just into an overly subjective account. Intertextuality, according to Michael Klein, works both from the past and from the future of a given work. In my historical reconstructions of interpretive meaning in the book, I'd like to think that a work is only in dialogue with that which came before. But inevitably, my perspective from the present affects how I interpret the past. However, there's a difference. A composer cannot directly quote or allude to a work that has yet to be written. Rather, the composer may anticipate a musical process or perhaps suggest a topic that becomes clearer for a present-day interpreter only from the perspective of that later, perhaps more foregrounded manifestation of the process or topic. Yes, there's a danger of hermeneutics becoming too subjective in this way, but I see a counterbalancing grounding in a musical style and what I call a more rigorous methodological dialectic that keeps the main focus on the semiotic interpretation of a work in its historical contexts. I could be criticized for taking too romantic a perspective on dramatic trajectories in Bach, for example. I tried to emphasize that in calling it a tone poem, but I nevertheless, it may be that my work with Beethoven suggested such expressive journeys. Actually, I think it was more my exposure to an analysis of this work by David Cranbuell back when I was just a doctoral student that inspired my thinking of Bach in this way. But even if my work with Beethoven may have suggested such expressive journeys, I can nevertheless make a case for Bach's dramatic shapes without intertextually referencing Beethoven, as in the E minor Sinfonia. So would you like to follow up?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Our next question from Professor Cristina Gerling.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Okay, so I really thank you with all my heart for your commentaries and explanations on Brahms piano music. And as a teacher, as a piano teacher, Brahms piano music poses a tremendous challenge to most students. So concerning this passage on page 121 of the Virtual Agency book, Brahms' extended descent through 2 more thirds creates an effect akin to slipping away from both metric time and tonal space. The further sense of temporal stretching, emphasized by the careful attention to every note in Brahms's note to Clara, may suggest an early move toward interiorization, a virtual subjectivity ruminating over deepening pools of potential reflection, if you will. Have you reached a point in music history where virtual subjectivity can be staged in 5 notes? So this is your question. And I was very sorry that you stopped at the question mark. So I beg you to answer. And it's not fair to say that the answer is the rest of the book. If you could so kindly, please.
Yes, indeed. I'll try to answer as directly as I can. Of course, that was a rhetorical question meant to suggest that if it would be possible, I wanted to provoke that kind of thought. It's a bit of a play on this notion. I can identify that tune in 3 notes, 4 notes. And I'm being a bit silly here, but actually Beethoven was able to stage the essence of tragedy in just 4 notes with the subject head of his string quartet fugue in C sharp minor, opus 131. All that's very positive, right? As though we're resolving 5/7 to 1, but the 1 resolution is in the weak beat of the measure. And the 4th note is what creates the tragic reversal. Suddenly we reverse direction, we take a drop, and we know for the first time it's the minor mode. Ran out of breath. And that sforzando that he places on the A at that point, on this flat 6, is just in 4 notes, the hopeful rise and tragic reversal of that hope that suggests in that short of space, the quintessential tragic expressive genre. Of course, the number of the notes isn't the point. Other cues for interiority include the rhetorical gestures and pauses that we saw before. Even a rest, no notes at all, could be a signal for an interiorizing. The theme by Brahms, if you're not familiar with, there's the tonic triad. He keeps going down and giving you the sort of the subdominant, if you will, in a kind of Riemannian reversal or mirroring of the minor. But of course, it goes beyond the meter and it keeps going down as though it were continuing to arpeggiate a chord that would just go down to the very basis of our human feeling and emotion. It's just such a beautiful analog towards spiraling down, perhaps, into the depths of one's thoughts. And that wonderful image that Brahms gives in his letter, he's writing to Clara, a pianist, almost to say, be sure on every note, almost a portato touch on every note. Of course, that's maybe a little too slow, but nonetheless could compromise with that notion that each pitch is, in a sense, a sospiro. And it already, each pitch has the qualitative effect from a performer of being a deep, subjective sigh. And then the whole patterning going beyond the bar line and beyond the tonic root frees us from the constraints and takes us to a realm that is staged metaphysicality, if you will. In other words, how can music stage this? By going beyond the conventional boundaries, and hence, as we saw in the Beethoven theme, expressing freedom in some sense.
Yes, but, oh, sorry. But I've heard this particular intermezzo described in terms of ambiguity. And what you were saying is that it's not. Each note means something very particular and very deliberate. Am I reading correctly?
Well, I would not want to to counter the notion of ambiguity, because that's also part of it. We don't know how far we're going to go, how many thirds it's going to take.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And of course, for Brahms, you think of the opening of the Fourth Symphony, or the one of the four serious songs. He just loves that descent in thirds, and he got it from Beethoven. You can find that same descent in thirds in the development of the slow movement of the Hammerklavier sonata. You can also find in the Hammerklavier a prefiguring of Brahms's theme for the Second Symphony. Da, 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 you know, it's da, 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 part of the second theme. So clearly there's that intertextual element as well. But descents in thirds have this capacity to go on, and they want to reach completion like the circle of fifths reaches completion, because you can keep descending in thirds and eventually get back home by way of eventually descending to the dominant and then resolving, you know.
Okay.
So that's one factor. But yes, I would say that rather than saying it's just ambiguous, there's a positive component to the expressivity. And the positive component is that we are continuing to experience each moment, each phenomenological moment, with its own sense of mystery, so that even the first three notes, the way you could play it, would be magical.
Do you have a piano nearby that you can show us?
I don't know how well it will sound on Zoom, but I could try.
Please do.
Okay. Tell me if this is too awful.
It's good. Keep going.
I'm sorry, the quality of sound is not very good.
It is good.
Uh-huh.
It is good.
Now you can see that without actually watching my hands playing that, you might just think I was just playing legato. But that's where the visual and gestural element can come in performance as well, because I was actually giving a slight gesture of the hand to each pitch, while at the same time trying to respect it's being tucked into a larger gesture of the five notes.
Thank you.
So if that helps.
Thank you very much.
That's a great question, though. I'm glad you raised it.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Now we'll move on to our next question. Professor Flavio Santos Pereira.
Okay, can you see me?
I just see the black.
Oh,
You can turn on your video if you wish. I
well,
see your name in a black box.
okay, I think,
But I can hear you perfectly.
okay. I am trying.
Yes,
Okay.
you're there now. Thank you.
Okay.
I see you. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk with you, to participate in this event. About my question concerning this passage from your book. It is imaginatively interactive participation that I investigate in this book under the rubric of virtuality. How can we apply analytically the concept of imaginatively interactive participation? How does virtuality condition this concept? Your book deals also with numerous recurrences of the term subjectivity, virtual subjectivity, intense experience of subjectivity, virtualizing and fictionalizing subjective engagement, enlarging your subjective awareness, conceptions of musical subjectivity, the emergence of subjectivity, staging of subjectivity, multiple, errant, or alternate subjectivity, robust subjectivity. What is the relationship between imaginatively interactive participation and subjectivity?
Good. These are many questions. I'll start.
Yes.
With imaginatively interactive participation is my way of describing engagement by an actual interpreter, be the interpreter, the composer even, but also the listener or performer or critic. How a listener becomes involved in identifying with an inferred virtual agency. Imagined, since virtual and not actual. Interactive, since it requires a willingness to interpret by participating in the journeys of that agency and relating them to one's own journeys, either physically as a body in space or cognitively as an unfolding complex of emotions and thoughts, or some combination of these. So in other words, all of these aspects of subjectivity are in negotiation, that which is virtually staged and that which is actually negotiated by a listener interpreter. But subjectivity is a huge concept, and as your quotes suggest. For my purposes, what I mean by subjectivity is that robust subjectivity, in other words, a healthy subjectivity comprised of the kinds of things that I found already staged, or whether wittingly or not, in Boethius in the around 545 Common Era, in his Consolation of Philosophy. I chose that because it was widely read for 1,000 years and would have been a part of any educated person's notion of what subjectivity might comprise itself of. In other words, what is it that we as human thinkers and beings do inside these wonderful heads of ours? And some of the characteristics were the ability to think freely, freedom of thought. I mean, Boethius was in prison when he wrote this, but he realized that his mind was free, framed within an inner dialogue. This is very important because I talk about two actors on the surface of the drama might actually be internalized as two ways of thinking about the same thing by one singular subjectivity, okay? So dialogue, fusing emotion and thought to achieve moral emotions. I thought that was important as well. The capacity to experience cathartic emotions and to experience mixed emotional thoughts or conflict. Self-reflectivity and self-reflexivity as the ability to consider one's state from a higher perspective. Even intertextually expanded consciousness as informed by one's culture. You can find it all in Boethius. It's a remarkable book, and it's not even about music. And the capacity to realize the actual from the virtual or allegorical. In other words, you could even believe yourself into one's envisioned state. You know, if you whistle, you'll feel courageous, right? Of course, it is one thing to experience all these things personally, and another to find them staged in a work of music. And not all musical works stage all these elements of subjectivity. But it takes imaginatively interactive participation to go beyond merely identifying them, and instead, by identifying with them, to negotiate a rich and aesthetically warranted experience of virtual subjectivity as activated by one's own subjectivity. So in other words, I lay out these 7 or 8 features of a robust, healthy, rich subjectivity, inner life, if you will, and say, throughout music history, composers have found ways of staging these kinds of things, freedom or interiorization or the capacity to go towards that which is most hoped for, even if it's ultimately destroyed at the end with a tragic reversal. So now, there are many other kinds of subjectivity. Fractured subjectivity is one that I talk about, and where Susan McClary speaks of this in the sense of our fractured subjectivities from the 20th century being imposed upon, say, the first movement of Beethoven's string quartet in A minor, opus 132. There, I would argue that no, it's a singular subjectivity who's experiencing this extreme conflicts inside a single mind. It's not like a bunch of different subjectivities splattered on the page, but rather Beethoven's very careful to provide, despite all of his surface discontinuities, an underlying sense that these are all experienced by a singular subjectivity. Okay, does that help?
Okay, okay. Thank you for your answer. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, only one for you. Subjectivity, it's a form of freedom for the performer.
For the
Can be.
Well, the performer can bring his or her own subjectivity to and project his or her own subjectivity. Now, the degree to which the performer does that, I talk about two different stances, and we'll get to that, I think, in the next question. You know, to what degree should a performer inject his or her own personality?
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, we'll get to that in question number 5. Okay, on to number 4. Professor Neto.
Professor Hatten, for me, it's a great honor to be in this meeting.
Well, thank you.
In my study group, we hold your theories in high esteem. I want to thank Professor Rodolfo's invitation, express my satisfaction for sharing this table with research of such high rank within our academy. With everyone's permission, I ask to Professor Rodolfo to read my question to make it more audibly clear. Thanks again for this opportunity.
Thank you very much for your question.
So I will read for my friend Diósnio Neto. Concerning this statement, plenitude conceived as both premise and topic need not to be tied to a particular affective state. Beethoven's obsessive presto in opus 130 conveys a dysphoric plenitude, expressively doubled by the euphoric plenitude of the andante. As part of a compositional premise, plenitude leads to the ultimate saturation of texture and fulfillment, perhaps even apotheosis in the case of a theme. As a topic, the relative textural, registral, and active level saturation, characteristic of plenitude, is present in the opening themes of both presto and andante. Can you develop briefly this concept of plenitude in relation to the negotiation strategy between the expressive field and the formal design?
Yes, thank you. Great question. Plenitude, as you can see from the quote, is a means of thematic and textural completion as well. It has a long history from the saturation of texture by rhythmic diminutions or thematic and textural intensification through stretto, which we saw, to the integration of thematic material, as in the last example from the Chopin Ballade. Such filling of textural, thematic, even registral space can suggest fulfillment and hence completion. And typically that fulfillment is experienced as blissful, but not always. It can also be experienced as an intensification of any prevailing affect, even dysphoric or tragic ones, right? As blissful, it is a useful strategy for enhancing any expressive genre or dramatic trajectory that moves toward transcendence. A parallel concept is apotheosis, the kind of aggrandizement of a theme that includes saturation and dynamic intensity. And you mentioned the case in the string quartet opus 130. Here, an early plenitude is achieved, but cannot be sustained. And thus the local plenitude becomes premise for the global drama of attempts to achieve and sustain plenitude as a state of blissful serenity, if you will. For the galant style, moving earlier, plenitude is typically achieved through progressive diminutional variations, whether in variation sets or aria-like contexts, where the da capo elaborations can create similar effects. However, in his book, Music in the Galant Style, Robert Gerling would likely argue against the kinds of dramatic trajectories that I find in Mozart, since for galant music, quote, courtly listening habits seem to have favored music that provided opportunities for acts of judging, for making of distinctions, and for the public exercise of discernment and taste. And while that may be true for earlier Mozart, there's ample evidence in the works themselves for the claims that I have made about later works of Mozart, such as the slow movement we just looked at, which also has its moments of expressive and dramatic plenitude if we had time to look at the whole movement. So I hope that addresses some aspects of how plenitude can be not just a topic, but also a premise, as you pointed out.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you. These are great questions, and I had time to prepare answers.
Good afternoon, Professor Hatten. And first of all, I'd like to thank Rodolfo for the opportunity to compose this roundtable, and also you for your willingness to answer our questions.
I appreciate the opportunity.
Can you listen to me well?
Yes, very well.
Okay, as a piano teacher, as you can see in this question, my interest is directed to the means of expressing both virtual agency and underlying deep structure in actual performance. So I will read my question. In your book of 2004, you pointed out the common sense opposition between structure and expression should be reviewed for the sake of interpretation. In this sense, interpretation should be capable of bringing structure to the fore without giving up expression, or conversely translating expressive patterns into actual sound without losing its structural roots. More recently, you went further and defined this multi-leveled integrative discourse as mellows. In your own words, I elaborate a fresh concept of musical mellows with a special attention to techniques that enhance the integration of melody with counterpoint, harmony, and motive as support for the continuity of agents through the unfolding of a musical discourse. Heinrich Schenker, despite dismissing the need of a particular performance for a musical work to exist, was clearly aware of the power of musical gesture in guiding or losing the listener, and coined the concepts of dissembling and framing touch to bridge the gap between background and foreground. Could you relate your concept of mellows to Schenker's dissembling and framing touch, and in relation to musical notation, comment on the power of musical gesture to unveil the hidden music behind the score?
Yes, thank you. Great question. I'll prepare for it by explaining a little bit more about this concept of mellows we've discussed already today. I've considered it to be an important bridging concept in my theory in the move from multiple actants, such as gestures or motives or individual lines, to their integration into singular agents. And of course, ultimately, even from multiple actors to their integration into a singular subjectivity, all virtual. We saw the examples from Bach and I mentioned Beethoven. Schenker's concepts of dissembling and framing touch are not directly related to mellows, but one might make the connection by noting how performance is another means of staging agential integration by revealing hierarchical relationships among pitches and bringing out those structural lines that form the backbone of themes. And in fact, there's There's a great example of this in the section where I'm dealing with Bach from an Allemande from the Partita in D major. I don't know if anybody can see that example very well. But it's, if you have your books, it's on page 105. And you can see that what we have in the left hand is a series of 5/6, 5/6 sequential ascent. And the right hand, as free as it is basically in parallel tenths with the bass. So in other words, what we have is a kind of scaffolding, a contrapuntal scaffolding, such that although we have what looks like melody in the complement, it is contrapuntally designed in such a way that everything is moving up in a singular purport, a singular direction, with a singular expressive port. Now, in performing this, I don't bring out the tenths per se. I do bring out the 5/6 motion because that is such a characteristic and even expressively loaded type that Eugene Narmore, for example, analyzed as already occurring expressively back in the Renaissance. And whenever we find it, I gave an example from Haydn as well. There are examples in Beethoven. It tends to have this sense of uplifting emotion step by step as it spider walks its way upward. First this voice, then that, to avoid the parallel fifths. But certainly the scaffolding is what holds this together and merges these three voices into a singular purport. So I would, you would certainly reveal in performance that hierarchical relationship through your sequential performance of it. But I would caution against overly didactically bringing out such middle ground lines, since there is too much gestural meaning that can be lost if one does not also respect the character of the surface. And this is what you suggested in the opening of your question. It's what I like to call the irreducible significance of the surface, which can also be projected in performance. Just as we know what the structural pitches are, but sometimes we bring out the appoggiatura, which is not the structural pitch, but it is the expressive pitch against which we understand the structural pitch. The theorist who best provides access to these kinds of complementary approaches, in other words, we want to get the structure, but we want to get the character of the surface, is Alexandra Pierce in her book, Deepening Musical Performance Through Movement, which I published in the book series, A Musical Meaning and Interpretation, back in 2007 at Indiana. She offers heuristic exercises, exercises that allow you to discover what interpretation you want to give. And she encourages Schenkerian listening, for example, stepping the fundamental bass, in coordinating deeper structural progressions with surface characterizations, or what she calls tones of voice that respect those affect-filled gestures and contours. And then the next step is to try to find that right balance between the two. And it's possible to get there. Sometimes you have to focus on one aspect of structure or one aspect of expression, and then gradually sort of bring these together to negotiate them into your ultimate performance. In teaching a class on performance and analysis, I found in a case of a student who sat down and played the middle section of the Chopin F sharp major prelude, so overheated and overwrought that it was just, a shambles in a way. And so I had him do nothing. I say, play it unexpressively and follow as someone else simply provides this exercise of ping and lilt, so that you stay exactly with the meter and understand the beauty of the metric wave itself. And so he played it that way. And everybody in the class, their jaws just dropped. It was so beautiful. And he looked aghast and he said, but I wasn't doing anything. So it was quite a lesson in sometimes letting the music speak for itself. Now, of course, he was doing something. He wasn't overdoing it. He wasn't consciously adding that layer of goo, of expressive goo that made it too much, overfreighted with projecting his emotions. And yet this kind of more classical way of stepping back and letting the music speak, brought out beauties that he was unaware of. The beauties, exactly as you're pointing out, of those framing structural aspects, in this case, meter and timing. So we also did a Schenkerian analysis of the passage to understand how the circle of fifths motion that underlies it actually speeds up at a certain point, and at this point slows down and then speeds up at the very end to catch up. So catching all those, the wit, as she calls it, the wit of the passage, can be a very meaningful process. So your question is very deep and unanswerable by me alone. It just has so many dimensions to it, but it's a great question.
Thank you very much. I was thinking, and I read the passage about Alexander Pierce's work, and it was exactly in this sense I was thinking about this question. And yes. Also, I think what attracted me in your theory is the possibility of not only imagining in a very rich and subjective manner, but the possibility of communicating it, not communicating the content of my fantasy, but in exciting another person's fantasy by the means I found as a performer. Yes. To express myself. So it's more it's not so dependent on the content of the fantasy, but the way my fantasy touches another one fantasy, something like that. That was trying to think of which performing means would make it possible.
Mm-hmm. I've experimented in different ways and keep playing these pieces, the examples that we talked about earlier with the slides. I keep experimenting and trying heuristically to discover ways that I can step back. And for example, in playing Chopin, there are places where I take very literally that notion that the left hand should be absolutely even and the right hand can be free. Like the third time the theme comes back in the fantasia-like texture. I'll often work on the left hand as very even, and then bring in the right hand as a filigree that is absolutely free, doesn't have to even meet at the downbeat, that can spill over. And having the structured with the free in a kind of counterpoint brings out some extraordinary effects. Also experimenting with playing something in a pedaled haze when it is parenthetical, where it doesn't need to be strongly presented. I talk about that in the chapter on the ballade. Mm-hmm. So there are lots we can continue to experiment. And of course, this is still not, it's projecting our interpretation in a sense, but it's not over specifying the fantasia that a listener can then bring. In other words, we're just finding the best possible ways to present the virtual agential drama that we are interpreting. And then through their own engagement, the individual listener will negotiate their subjectivity, their experience, their sensibility, their grounding in some situation or experience that makes it vital and relevant for them. And so we provide that service. So, but there, of course, are the range of stances that a performer can take, from directly projecting one's own personality, to stepping back and just being a servant of that virtual agency that one nevertheless is projecting. That's more obvious and more subtle ways of projecting, you might say. But in either case, we are manipulating, not just literally with the hand, but manipulating an interpretation by channeling it in certain ways we would like for it to go, regardless of what liquid the channel is filled with. But we make sure that it's channeled in the right directions, with the right degree of force and the right degree of intensification.
Yeah, in this sense, analysis has nothing to do with limiting expression or imagination, as some performers sometimes think that analysis is against performance and freedom, but in this sense, it's exactly the opposite.
Right. And it's a sense in which if you were to use the term formalist, that sounds pretty bad. It's as though you're just taking an objective view towards everything. But if someone calls me a formalist poet, I take it as a compliment, because in poetry, forms are only used for their expressive purport. In other words, ones who use more forms are trying to get more expressivity out of their poetic texts. So we need to have the same hermeneutic approach to music, that we constantly are looking at forms and structures in terms of their expressive motivation. Why would a composer expand here or contract there? Why would a composer not so much deform, but find new ways of applying stylistic principles, maintaining a very positive and expressive perspective on analysis? I'm writing a big article on a speculative hermeneutic approach to music, which is basically what I've been trying to do for these 3 books, but trying to lay it out in a way that ties it to historical as well as present day efforts to get at expressive meaning in music. And there's so many things we need to bring to bear. It's almost impossible for one person to do more than scratch the surface. But that's why there's so many of us. We can learn from each other and keep building a community of interpreters. And that's part of the process as well. The work is not a single performance, but it accumulates from a history of its reception as well, and a critical filtering of its reception history in each subsequent performance or critical discussion of it. We have time for one more, I hope.
Thank you very much, Professor.
You're very welcome.
So the last one is Professor Paulo de Tarso Salles.
I am here. First of all, I want to congratulate Professor Rodolfo and Cássia for the initiative and all the Brazilian music theory team for the brilliant organization of this event. And I want to say thank you to Professor Robert Hatten for your generosity and your time sharing with us your knowledge, your expertise. Well, our time is running fast, so I will limit myself to my question that is motivated for something you mentioned in your book, an article by John Brink, and something I read in Eero Tarasti's book, 1994 book, A Theory of Musical Semiotics.
Mm-hmm.
And even in your 2004 book, when you speak about, you talk about the type 4, the performer as narrator.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned that the performer is an actual agent in the sense that he is the agent who is producing the sound. On the other hand, you wrote, the critical starting point for my theory is the capacity to imagine a virtual agency in the sounds themselves. Thus, a music internal action implies a virtual actant. Is this related to the role of the narrator communicating the musical narrative in a time different from the action? And also, can the virtualization processes be understood as the fruition of the sound expression through a narrator-interpreter?
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, let me say that in the current book, the Virtual Agency book, I devote chapters to both performative and narrative agency, and they're different types as well. You're absolutely right. In the gesture book, I noted performative agency because a performer can take one or more stances. A performer can try to reproduce the effect of a surprise on the virtual agent and emulate that surprise in his or her own body. Or the performer could be like a magician who basically says, I'm in control, I'm narrating, I'm not just narrating, but in control of all the special effects. I made that happen, and look, don't I have power? You know, and a performer could do either of the, take either or anything in between as a stance towards this. So a performer gets to decide how to narrate, in that sense, the virtual plot of the music. Now, the musical work itself may have a virtual staged narrator or narrative agency if it's not personified as a narrator. And in that case, we would assume that it doesn't necessarily have to be the composer, or it could be the composer, but coming from outside of the virtual agency, but still staged within the work itself. So there are many complicated versions of this. And I mentioned some of the ways in which we shift in level of discourse. Those are also ways by shifting to another plane outside of the discourse and commenting upon it. That is one of the roles of a narrator, to do just that. To interpret for us, or to frame for us, or to provide a perspective upon the events that are taking place. Now, this can also lead to concepts such as romantic irony, when at the end of the Serious Quartet, Opus 95 of Beethoven, all of a sudden, after we've already had a coda in the finale, there's what I call an addendum. Dum, dum, da, 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 and it just seems to go crazy in a buffa mania. It's been completely unprepared topically or musically, structurally, and yet it happens, it's added on, and it perhaps cues us to interpret a kind of annihilating laughter, as Jean-Paul Richter called it, as a cue for this kind of commentary that one could assume a narrative agent, in this case a compositional agent staged in the music, is taking towards his or her own discourse. Beethoven saying, I've given you 4 tragic movements. Now, I'm going to dismiss it all. There's a great story where Beethoven was improvising one of his adagios, I assume, in a salon, and he happened to notice in the midst of his improvisation that everyone was in tears. And he jumped up and said, "You're all fools," and he dashed out of the room. That to me is characteristic of the ending of the Serious Quartet, almost as though to dismiss your own discourse is a higher level, almost a cosmic level of irony, right? But on the other hand, there could have been other reasons why he did that. He might have felt that somehow they were looking, and the tears were tears of pity for him, or his growing, or his self-consciousness about his growing deafness, or whatever. So, I mean, we don't know all the psychological ramifications, but that is one form of shift, of radical shift in level of discourse. And these shifts can produce irony. They can also produce narrative effects. One of the great modes of creating narrative effect is in the Midsummer Night's Dream overture by Mendelssohn. He sets up a frame. Before we get to the fairy music, we have the Once Upon a Time music. And within that framing music, he also uses what one might call a backwards harmonic motion, 5 going to 4, a retrogression it's sometimes called. That also suggests if you're going backwards in time, that's taking you from the present into another time, a world, another place, in this case, a fantasy world. So it's not just a separate time, but a separate place. And by framing and by using these kinds of cues, I think Mendelssohn sets us up beautifully to transport us to a different place that is in a sense being narrated, as we can assume from the framing, which stages a kind of virtual narrator. Does that help a little bit? It's just, there's so many
inspiring
questions, but I try to address some of these things in these 2 chapters on performative and narrative agency in the book.
Great. I'm working on that right now. Yeah. Thank you so much.
wonderful. I've just enjoyed this so much.
Oh, I enjoyed.
I know that
quite
we're
a lot.
past the time, but I'm happy to stay if there are any other questions that anyone would like to pose. Rodolfo, has anything cropped up in the chat that would be of interest?
I want to acknowledge the presence of Professor Stephen Soderberg, that is our guest for the next meeting. And,
I'm new to Zoom, so I don't know if you can see me or not.
Here you are, right in the middle. Yes.
Oh, okay. Hello, everyone.
Thanks for dropping in.
and he represents the other extreme of the music theory that deals with very deep mathematical subjects, but also has a tremendous ability to deal with other aspects. I follow him in Facebook, where he presents a lot of material. So I invite everybody that is present here to attend also next, from 15 days from now, or 2 weeks from now, Professor Stephen Soderberg. I think I will shorten this session, because we're running almost 2 hours of meeting. I think I think I overdid invitations for people to prepare questions. So the questions were very loaded with content and challenge for your answers. So I think we did already enough time for the meeting. And I want to thank you, everybody, for being here, especially Professor Hatten, for being so available for a long presence of 2 hours with us. And maybe he can attend other meetings also with us. Okay.
Thank you to all of you, Rodolfo for the organization, Cássia for technical support, and all the panelists who asked such wonderful, engaging questions. Made me think.
And I want to acknowledge also the presence of Christian Utz, that will be the next guest, and Professor Schmalfeld. Schmalfeld is also, in the last meeting, was also present here. And this is a very interesting panel that we have for international guests participating in our society. That's a new society, has only 6 years of existence, but is thriving.
That's quite clear. I appreciate so much the invitation.
So let's finish for now.
Look, Rodolfo, Cristina has wrote in the chat about a student, Rafael, who wants to pose a question. Is it possible?
I'm open.
Rafael?
Hello, everyone. Professor Rodolfo, is it all right if I ask the question?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so thanks for the opportunity for me to be here to participate, and for Professor Hatten as well for the wonderful talk and to share his knowledge. Can you hear me well, Professor Hatten?
Yes, very clear.
Okay, so if you would like as well, I written down my question. If that would be helpful, I can post that on the chat, if you will.
Just go ahead and share it verbally with us, vocally.
Okay. So I will just read my question, if that can help. So I would like to ask you this. It seems that your virtual agency theory and other theories in the similar fields, perhaps like narrative theory and topic theory, have been focusing in analyzing art music from classic to romantic and contemporary music, right?
Yes.
And do you see that your theory and these other theories in general are applicable to other styles of music? For example, music that is not based or transmitted in a written text, like the score, but developed and transmitted in a recorded format in the 20th century, what we might call popular music, like jazz, free jazz, and other kinds of instrumental music that have improvisation as a big part of the music? Or perhaps this theory would not be applicable to these other styles of music, and why not?
Okay.
Thanks very
Yes,
much.
that's a great question. I don't talk a lot about popular music because I'm not well versed in it, and showing the range of examples, I did mention aspects of improvisation, for example, and how a performer might approach a Mozart piece, where there are opportunities for adding our cadenza in a Haydn composition. But specifically for jazz and improvisational works, yes, indeed. I think that there's, even in a tradition that does not tie itself to the score, it's even more virtual in that sense, because we end up following something. And what is it that we follow? Agentially, we follow a melody, in other words, the theme or the tune that is being covered, as it were, in a particular thing, and then we follow motives. I had a student who was in my analytical techniques class, wonderful jazz pianist. He had his own group, and at Indiana at the time, there was a little place called Bears that has a little bar in the back, and they had performances of this jazz group. And we were working on issues of developing variation, Schoenberg's notion of taking an idea and evolving it. And of course, that happens in jazz all the time, but he got just utterly fascinated with it, and he decided he would concentrate on that aspect in his improvisation. Now, is that virtual agency or not? I would say that, in a sense, each of the members of a jazz ensemble can either be a solo agent and project the kind of solo agential in their solos, or they come together in a kind of merging as a kind of virtual subjectivity in which all the members of the ensemble playing at once are feeding off of each other, becoming parts of a single organism. And that would be akin to the multiple actors merging into singular subjectivity. So those are some of the ways in which I could see it applying to jazz very well. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, it clarifies me a lot, and to see that you think in that way, that it's applicable to other kinds of music, and I think it clarifies a lot of interesting things about your theory. Thank you very much for your answer.
Thank you, Rafael. Any other questions? Probably maybe this is as good time as any to bring it to a close.
Okay.
Thank you all.
So my function now, because I don't know how to put my camera on, to restart my camera, so you only will listen to me declaring this session over. Okay.
Thanks to all.
Thank
you, Professor Hatten. Thank you.
Good to see you again, Paulo.
And thank you.
Thank
I'd
you,
like to see you
Hatten.
too, Robert.
Muito obrigado. Muito
You're
obrigado.
looking good. Healthy.
Thank you very much, Professor. Obrigado, Rodolfo. Obrigado, todo mundo.
Peace and health.
Obrigado. Thank you.
Thank you for your generosity.
Thank you all.
Till the next time.
Yes, of course.